almost every year around about this time, a couple of days before Christmas, somebody asks me, what should I get for my friend or my partner or my sister or my brother who wants to try knitting or crochet? And here is my tips and tricks and advice for if you find yourself in that situation. The first most important thing is to know if they're interested in knitting or in crochet. If you don't know that, you're going to really struggle to find something they're actually interested in. So make sure that you figure that one out first. The second thing is, how experienced are they right now in either one of those fibre arts? If somebody is an absolute beginner to either craft, I always recommend getting them a kit. And the reason that I say this is because you'll get everything that you need for one project all together. You'll get the right needles, you'll get the right yarn, you'll get any notions that you need, and you'll get instructions, and you'll also tend to get really good tutorials alongside the kit. So it allows somebody to test it in the safest way they possibly can without having to learn about gauge or matching the right yarn to the right project, without having to do anything potentially too complicated, and also with somebody who's there watching them video tutorials a whole way through so that they definitely know what they're doing. So anybody who asks me, what should I get for my friend who's interested in starting for the first time, I always say, start with a kit, maybe a scarf, maybe a hat, maybe a toy if they're going to be into crochet, that sort of thing. If somebody is slightly more intermediate and they've been knitting or crocheting for a while, I would always recommend, and these are things that I never get enough of, so I would always get somebody like that, new stitch markers, new row counters, new tapestry needles, new needle tips. If all of this is gobbledygook to you, apologies. Let me show you some of my stitch markers that I got as a gift a few Christmases ago, and which I use all the time, and they're some of my favourite ones. Absolute favourite stitch markers to use. There's this little sheep and an even smaller one as well. That's the thing with any one of those gifts, stitch markers, needle tops, you can get things that really reflect that person's personality. So you can get something really creative. You can get, if they're really into Lego, I'm sure you can get Lego stitch markers and Lego needle tops. So you can add another bit of what you know about the person into that gift. So I reckon that's always a really good gift for an intermediate knitter or crocheter. I don't think I've ever bought stitch markers myself, and I always also get the open and closed ones. The ones that I just showed, they just slide on and you can't adjust them, but you can also get these kind of light bulb ones that you can pin open and they look a little bit like safety pins, and those again are really good for people who don't have loads and who just need tons and tons. I personally am losing them all the time, so if you get me some of those, they'll always get used. They will always get used. Tapestry needles, I'm also always losing. I'm also always losing needle tops. And basically, I'm just going through the notions now. Anything that is considered to be like a knitting notion, I think you can't go wrong with. Row counter, tape measure as well, I would also suggest as a good gift. Personally, I am drowning in tape measures. I have like 3 or 4 and I keep them in lots of different places, so I never seem to lose out on a tape measure. But if you know that that person only has one, then definitely getting them a backup will not go amiss. Will not go amiss. The other thing that I would say for an intermediate knitter, so somebody who's been doing it for a while, is if you know what type of knitting needles they use, this requires a little bit more stealth. Then I would also say get some interchangeable cables. I am always running out of the long cables that you put between interchangeable needle tips. I would never recommend going and getting new needle tips. For me, that is so specific. I really like mine to have a certain material. I like them to be a certain length. I also definitely like them to be a specific sort of brand. So that's a little bit more risky from my point of view. But I think trying to get the right cable and make sure it is the right brand, otherwise the person's not going to be able to use it with their needle tips, that again is something I'm always running out of and would always appreciate as a gift, even if it feels a little bit pedestrian and maybe not as fun as choosing a stitch marker. I haven't talked about yarn, and yarn is a bit of a risky gift to give sometimes to a knitter. Here's a couple of little things, little bits of advice that I would give. Figure out what it is that that person really likes to make, and then if you can, and if you feel confident enough, I would get the right type of yarn for those sorts of projects. The easiest example from my point of view is if you know somebody makes socks and they're always knitting socks and they love to make socks, then that is the easiest and honestly quite cost effective. It's not an expensive gift. You can go and get a fairly fancy skein of yarn that a person could make into a pair of socks, and that would cost you somewhere between 20 and 30 pounds. And again, you can be quite creative with that. You can choose colours that you think that they might like. You can choose colours that you like. You can choose different types of yarn like fades, or you can choose more speckled yarns. The world is your oyster if you know that you're buying for a sock knitter. Easiest thing in the world. If you're interested in buying yarn and you don't think that the person likes to make socks, then you're in a slightly trickier position. I think the hardest amount of yarn to be gifted is about 200 grams of fingering weight or DK weight yarn. That's not enough for somebody to make a sweater, and it's a little bit too much to make something like a hat or a pair of gloves or anything like that. So if you're thinking about getting a small amount of yarn, if you can't afford to get sort of 400 grams, 500 grams of yarn, that's obviously very specific to the sort of size that I am. Other people might need a lot more in order to make a sweater or a top or anything like that, or a lot less. Then I would suggest that you try and get something that's a bit more special, a bit more colourful, something that's got a bit of a story behind it. And again, try and copy the sorts of colours that they tend to use. Try and copy the sorts of, if you can, the sorts of material that they tend to use, or the fibre content that they tend to use. If you know that they're always knitting with wool, then acrylic's probably not going to go down the best with that person. Then lastly, for somebody who's been knitting for a really long time, a more advanced knitter, potentially, what I would always suggest is that you get them a pattern book. And I'm going to show a book that I got as a gift a few years ago, which is one of my top favourite books. And a lot of people will know about this one, but it's called the Japanese Knitting Stitch Bible. And it's got in it loads and loads of different beautiful stitches with very complex charts that will help you to be able to make that quite detailed stitch if you are more advanced and more comfortable doing that. Some of these things look very beautiful, and honestly, I think for the majority of knitters or current fibre artists that might be a bit overwhelming, especially if you're kind of 1-2 years into the craft. But for a lot longer down the line, I think something like that, when you get more comfortable reading charts, doing really complex stitch patterns, is a really good and worthwhile gift. I hope some of this has brought some inspiration. If you are kind of running around last minute, I believe in you. You can do it. It won't be hard. Try to support local yarn stores. They are the backbone of our industry where you can. Obviously, a voucher for somewhere like that for the knitter in your life, I think, will never go down anything other than with majesty, with aplomb. And if you are a knitter or a crocheter and you think that I've missed something out, I would love to hear it. Please drop a comment down below and let me know what you give as advice for people looking to buy for knitters and other people in their lives.